live because I've seen a few different videos by a couple different people now on the whole situation as it pertains to the uh, so-called dirty B over there in Ukraine. So here's my take on it. Now, with all the phone calls that occurred, and I shared a video that pertains to that by that Duran channel. Those two guys are really hip to what's going on over there. I mean, these guys are quite astute and adept when it comes to reading the situation as it relates to all of Europe, Eastern and Western Europe, just the whole general situation in Europe. These guys are very astute. These guys are very aware of the inner workings of these different European regimes, even the Russian one, and they pay very close attention to everything, every last little detail that goes on with all these different dignitaries and diplomats and military leaders and everything that relates to the just overall general situation of Europe. So, be that as it is, I mean, I don't agree with everything they say because, of course, I have my own personal take on everything and my own personal studies, and all of my studies lead me to overall a different conclusion. I mean, I take aspects of everything that I learn from and I use it to paint a bigger picture by, as an amateur analyst, by connecting the dots, by connecting bits and pieces of information to make a much bigger picture, a much clearer picture, because, a lot of people have puzzle pieces and you can take a little bit from everybody. You take the meat, but you spit out the bones, as my friend Ken says. So in that case, watching these videos, I've watched a lot of Gonzalo Lira's videos before, and for those of you that have been on my channel for a while, I've shared some of those videos in my video rotation. But see, here's the thing: with all of that culminating together, what I understand of it is that there were a lot of phone calls, and the Russians have some very good intelligence gathering methods. Now, that could be anywhere between, electronic hacking, like hacking the, diplomatic systems or the military systems of different nations, as it relates to any sort of online communications, or it could be tapping into the underwater cables, the fiber optic cables, or other types of means. Those aren't the only two means they could have available. They could have, human intelligence, where they have agents that have slipped into key positions of prominence that report back. I mean, there's all kinds of ways they can gather intelligence. There's SIGINT, signals intelligence, ELINT. There's so many different means of intelligence gathering. HUMINT, which is human intelligence, like I just said. There's all sorts of ways they could be gathering the intel. So what I understand is that there were some phone calls back and forth between Shoigu and these different defense ministers. And the British, their defense minister, Ben Wallace, has admitted that the communications between Great Britain and the United States have been compromised. So he had to fly to Washington, as was mentioned in the video that I shared. Well, that means a lot of different things. It means, for one thing, that the Russians know exactly what's going on between the Western European nations of NATO, as well as what, is happening between them with the United States, based on their communications being compromised in such a way. So they know whatever it is that we were planning, and vice versa, as far as like the European involvement in it and whatever else, because the Europeans are basically, at this point, they're just vassal states of the United States. They're just, just might as well be all the same country at this point. The whole Western Bloc might as well just be one amalgamous blob of the same types of just kleptocracies and plutocracy. I mean, it's all a bunch of BS nonsense. But anyways, that notwithstanding, the phone calls between Shoigu and these other defense ministers indicates that they're telling them that, hey, we got your number, punk. We know what you're doing. We know what your involvement is. We know what you're planning. You better not. Yeah, and I mean it. You better not. Don't even try it. Is what I gather that was said between Shoigu to these different defense ministers. And it's also interesting that the Russians are being allowed by Turkey to deploy extra submarines out of the Black Sea to protect the Turk Stream pipeline so that it won't have a similar end to what the Nord Stream did by whoever sabotaged it, whether it was the Americans or whether it was the Germans, who been given the approval by the Americans, because the Germans certainly have some very good submarines too, even if only one of them works, because they won't repair their sub fleet and keep it up in working condition. And I'm talking about all their subs, because German defense spending is awful. It's awful. They don't maintain their military like they should, and they've really let themselves go. And that's why the West is not going to get involved as boots on the ground inside of Ukraine, because to do so would mean the end of European sovereignty, because Russia has weaponry that can strike every single solitary NATO base of every NATO nation and American bases in European nations. They can strike every single solitary one of those bases. Not a one of them is safe. And the Russians have shown that by hitting the Lviv training centers, where they would bring in these foreign mercs and house them and, train them, bring them up to speed on things. They hit Lviv with their Iskander shorter range tactical ballistic missiles, as well as their Caliber cruise missiles. And Europe is not a very big continent by any stretch of the imagination. And Russia, even from just their Kaliningrad enclave, they can hit basically anywhere in Europe with the weapons that they have there. The Kaliningrad enclave is just this, it's that piece of land. It's Russian territory. It's part of Russia. It's separate from mainland Russia, sort of like how Alaska is separate from the United States or Hawaii. But it's the same thing. They have the Kaliningrad enclave, and they have a whole bunch of different missile batteries stationed there of different ranges of missiles. Now they can hit any of our bases from there, or even really from mainland Russia. They have options available. It's not like that, that there's any safe place in Western Europe where we could build up. And not to mention that, they have their Chinese allies in theater too, in Serbia and also in Belarus, with those heavy armored units that trained outside of Moscow with the Russians in the recent war games a few months back, moving on further west. So there's a whole coalition of forces on the Sino-Russian side of things, because of course you also have Belarus being an ally of them, and you have Serbia. So that, that's quite a lot to contend with. It's definitely, even just Russia by themselves is plenty to deal with NATO. They don't even need help, but of course, when you have allies, they're going to come and help you anyway. Like in the case of China showing up in the region, for China to be in Europe, it's very, it's almost surreal, because 30 years ago, China was, even though they had this enormous military, it was mostly an army and a big air force. They didn't have the navy they have today, and they didn't deploy really out of Asia. They stayed in China predominantly, but now it's kind of crazy. Ever since Belt and Road happened, ever since, the advent of just their Belt and Road scheme, but also their further development, because they've always been really allies with Russia. They've always been on good terms with them, even during the Sino-Soviet split. Which I think is a little bit more exaggerated than what it really was. That was just a series of some mishaps and diplomatic misunderstandings that led to a little bit of friction here and there. But for the most part, China and Russia have always been on good terms, but they've really, really deepened their alliance, since the end of the 90s, because Russia remembers that China never stepped on them while they were down. China never kicked them while they were down. China didn't go in there and take back, Vladivostok, which used to be part of Greater Manchuria before the Russians ended up seizing it, during I think it was the Ming period, the Ming dynasty. They seized that area, and it used to be Greater Manchuria, but then it became, where Vladivostok is, the whole Vladivostok region of Russia, where it just sort of comes down there and connects to North Korea, and also, of course, it's adjacent to current day Manchuria now, across the Ussuri and Amur rivers there. So, that all used to be at one time part of China. China didn't go stomping in there and demanding it back and taking it back, when Russia was really weak after the collapse of the USSR. But Russia's really revived itself, and Russia remembers that China never kicked them while they were down. So, for China to go in there helping Russia is sort of like a big deal, because again, it's surreal after living, for over 30 years and seeing China develop how it's developed, becoming the world superpower, the most powerful nation on the face of the earth, in a 30-year span. It's just crazy to see them deploying all around the world now, especially in Africa too, between what they have in Africa and I was reading up a lot on that lately. China, through Belt and Road, has basically turned most of the nations in Africa into Chinese vassal states, basically like Chinese puppet regimes. And, they're making it exceedingly more difficult for us to be able to purchase oil from overseas, because the big oil producing regions in Africa are all brought into the fold of the Belt and Road, such as Angola, such as Nigeria. Even Libya joined the Belt and Road, and Libya is a failed state now, but Libya joined Belt and Road, and Libya has pretty sizable oil reserves, and they have some of the best crude oil on earth. Actually, it's some of the easiest to refine. And also Sudan as well. Russia is another one that's involved in Africa, not to the extent that China is, but Russia has gotten involved in Mali, the nation called Mali. They've also been involved in the Central African Republic, training up their military forces. Russia also in Port Sudan, is constructing a naval installation there in the Red Sea. So Russia and China, especially China, are very active in Africa. And of course, you have Russia and China building up their forces in Eastern Europe for the day that they're going to invade NATO. And of course, they're doing it covertly in North America. Both Russia and China have forces in Mexico. China has a lot of forces in Canada. Also Bahamas, Cuba. So does Russia has forces in Cuba too, Nicaragua, also Venezuela. Both Russia and China have troops in Venezuela. So, I heard some murmurings about this whole, America thinking about attacking Venezuela for its oil. I don't know about all that. That sounds a little far-fetched to me. I don't know. It's a little far-fetched. I don't see America trying to do anything like that. Now, I remember many, many, many months ago, I did say that there would be more theaters of war opening up. So I'm not saying that it's impossible, but I'm saying that when these other theaters do open up, they're going to divert even more money, even more resources, and ultimately even more troops away from home. Even if we don't get involved in these other theaters, they're going to divert more troops away from home, so that when it is time for them to take us down, they'll be able to isolate all these small pockets of troops and squash them all little by little by little. And I've said that before many months ago. You can go back. That was when I was making shorter videos. And it looks like it is starting to somewhat come into fruition, not just with the Ukraine thing, but with all the murmurings. I don't know about them actually pulling it off as far as the Venezuela thing, but if they started to try to, move any forces into Colombia or other things like that, it would fulfill what I said about, diverting away even more than what this proxy in Eastern Europe has already done. It would set the stage for a total defeat and a total disaster militarily if we were to try to divert anything else to any other areas of the world, any other theaters of war, should they break out or not. It's just Venezuela, because there's Chinese and Russians there. It would be such a disaster for us. It would be unreal. I mean, it would set off a whole chain of events. That's why I think, though, that before even any of these other things happen, before we even divert all these other assets around the world, before they get stuck there, the internal conflict will break out. We will have that internal conflict. We'll have that collapse and internal conflict first. Then when all those forces are all spread out around the world, that'll be when we get invaded. They'll all get stomped on too about the same time. I see a lot of those things happening all near simultaneously, as far as like the other theaters all mushrooming into like a third world war, wherein we also are a theater. Our home front here would be a theater. We would be invaded, of course. It would be the biggest invasion in all of human history. It would be at least 3 to 4 times bigger than Operation Barbarossa was in World War II, and up till even modern times, up till even today. Before such a thing happens, Operation Barbarossa is still the biggest invasion in the history of war. The biggest invasion in the history of war. So that gives you some perspective. If Operation Barbarossa involved 4 million invasion troops from the Germans and their smaller allies, of course, but mostly the Germans, if it involves some 4 million invasion forces going into the Soviet Union in World War II, for there to be a successful invasion of the United States, being as big as this country is, with as much of a population as it has, which is way more than what the USSR had back in the 40s, it would at least take 3 to 4 times as big of an invasion force. Now, China would be the only nation that could pull off such a feat, or China with other allies. And it will be China with other allies, because China alone has the manpower, but, of course, their other allies are going to help too, like Russia, like, Belarus, like Pakistan, North Korea, Iran, all of them, the whole gamut of them, all the little allies of Eurasia that totally hate us. The whole Eurasian bloc will pretty much be on our ass. But here's back to the original point. Now, when Shoigu called, like I said, he told them, I guarantee you, because, it was a low key situation, like they said in that Duran video, it wasn't put out in public what was said in the phone conversations, but, it likely went along the lines of, you better not let that happen, because if you do, we will stomp you. We will stomp you. And, deep down, I believe that the woke military, with woke Lloyd Austin at the helm, taking that phone call, I believe he shit his pants. I really do. I think he's scared. I think the woke military's scared. They can bluster and bluff all they want about talking about how they're going to get, a division here or a brigade there. What is an airborne division? It's a light unit. They're made to be parachuted behind enemy lines and to hold like key bridges or key infrastructure for a short period of time. They're not made for like going toe to toe against, heavy formations of armored forces and just, heavy combat forces with heavy artillery, tank forces, heavy mechanized infantry formations. They're not made to go up against all that. They're made to be dropped behind enemy lines and capture key areas, or to fight other light units. They're not made to fight heavy units. I'm not being that I was part of the American Armed Forces. I'm not speaking against them out of any sort of malice. I'm just talking about the realities of warfare. and how different units are used. For instance, you use a mountain unit for mountain warfare. You're not supposed to use like a mountain unit for fighting out in like open plains. They're called a mountain unit for a reason, like the 10th Mountain Division. They're trained to fight in higher altitudes in the mountains. You're not that's another type of generally light unit. It's a lighter unit. The heavy units are units like my old unit, like 3rd ACR. We had a lot of tanks. We had self-propelled artillery pieces. Like I was an artilleryman. I was a 13 Bravo when I was in the Army. So I was a cannon crew member, artilleryman basically. And what we did was, we were on self-propelled guns. We were a heavy unit, so we had to be mobile with our armored formations and provide them mobile artillery support with our self-propelled howitzers. That's how it worked. Any sort of like infantry elements we had were all mechanized. They rode in armor personnel carriers. We had Bradley infantry fighting vehicles in 3rd ACR. I mean, we had Abrams tanks. I mean, we were a heavy unit. That's what we were for. We were a heavy formation. We were there to go toe to toe against other heavy formations or to squash light formations if we were to come across any. But because the war I went to was a counterinsurgency operation, it was more of we were fighting insurgents. We weren't fighting another army when I was in the war in Iraq. It wasn't like, what is going on over there in Eastern Europe right now. So the war they're fighting over in Eastern Europe, if we were to get involved in our current state of decay, of depletion, of just this whole new generation of depleted, woke, hollowed out armed forces, I mean, it would be a disaster, And what Gonzalo Lira said was right. I mean, he was right on it. It would be such a case to where if we got involved and they tried to send American troops over from Romania into Odessa, and they started to try to, hold Odessa against the Russian invasion, they would get slaughtered. They would totally get slaughtered. And all that would serve to do would be to make things even worse for us. It would drag us into a war that we wouldn't be able to win. We would not be able to win it. I mean, if you guys watch my scenarios, then you know how things work. You know that the first thing they would do if we were to get involved in a conflict like that, the first thing they would do, they would take out our eyes and ears. They would knock our satellites out of the sky. They would hack our grid and shut it off, including the telecom, everything. They would hack it and shut it all off. They would totally gouge our eyes out with knocking the satellites down. They would do all of that first. Then all the Trojan units would emerge and they would just overrun us. They would just start capturing their objectives near simultaneously because it wouldn't take them very long to do so because these CCP properties are purchased and strategically placed near their objectives. That's where they've purchased their properties, to where it's strategically near their objectives, so that when they place their forces on these properties and their vehicles and their gear, everything they have, they'll be able to emerge and move right on to capture their objectives. And any external forces that they have in Canada and Mexico, Cuba, Bahamas, wherever else, Venezuela, Nicaragua, they're all going to partake in the invasion as well. They're going to cross the borders and beach land, and whatever airborne units are going to parachute in and capture key strategic areas, as a rapid reinforcements for the Trojans that are already in here doing the heavy lifting. That's how fourth generation warfare works. It's how hybrid warfare works. That's what it would be like. So I don't see this happening. I don't see it happening at all. I think Shoigu warned them, and they're going to listen. If let's take this for instance. When we invaded Iraq, we went in there supposedly looking for WMDs, but now, they just gave Russia yet another reason to hurry up and bring this thing to its quick end. Because if you think about it, we already know the Russians are building up these massive forces. I mean, I've only been talking about it for like the last, several lives. They've been building up these enormous forces. So these 300,000 troops that they mobilized out of their reserves, they're going to mix and match active and reserve elements when it comes to the force that they're building for the invasion. It's not all just going to be the reserves. They're going to, rotate reserves in to, pull some active guys out, so that the reserves can take their place while they're at the front. It's going to be something like that, where it'll be a mix and match between the reservists and the active duty forces that are building up at the at the front line for the invasion in Belgorod and also on the southern borders of Belarus. So this massive 300,000 man invasion force that'll be in addition to the forces they already have in eastern Ukraine carrying out the limited incursion mission that's been, going on for the last, 6-7 months now. Those additional forces are going to overrun Ukraine. And it's going to be over quick. It's not going to last very long because in Ukraine's weakened state, there's no physical way they can hold out against such overwhelming forces moving in. They're going to overrun them. They're going to steamroll that country, and it will not be a sovereign nation. It'll be reintegrated back into the Russian Empire or the Neo-USSR or whatever they're going to do to rebuild it. They're going to rebuild the old Russian Empire. China will enlarge itself too. It already has. It's already creating vassal states and an overseas colonial empire, stretching from Asia to Africa, and they're starting to involve themselves in the affairs of South American nations. It's very well known that Chinese are involved in Peru and Ecuador. They're heavily involved there. And also the Russians have a lot of sway in South America as well, over Brazil especially, but also Argentina. There's a lot of Chinese and Russian involvement all around the world. And a lot of it is somewhat covert, but it's not completely covert because it's known about. They're building bases, they're building infrastructure. They do it under the guise of helping to develop other countries, but like in the case of China especially, but what they're really doing is they're creating vassal nations, because once they conduct these projects, these development projects, then the country that they've developed is eating out of the palm of their hand, and they can do what they want with it because they have total control over that regime, and they can put whoever they want in power and make them a vassal state. You also have to understand that the Belt and Road is also a way to covertly get Chinese troops into the vassal nations, because just like they are in disguise here, they can be in disguise in other countries too. It's not like that's not happening. It's obvious that that's exactly what's happening. It's very obvious. So all in all, they're all over the world. In some cases, they're in uniform. In some cases, they're not. Like in Canada, they can brazenly march in uniform like they've been caught on Salt Spring Island. They've been filmed, and the local Canadians didn't even understand the ramifications of what they were even seeing. But Chi-Coms doing PT road marches in their uniforms is exactly what they were doing. Just like how we used to do that at Fort Hood. We would go march in our uniforms sometimes for PT. We'd go on a road march in uniform. And that's exactly what those Chinese troops were doing up there on Salt Spring Island, because they have a base nearby. So Chinese aircraft have also been seen flying over London, Ontario. There's another part of Canada. Plus the Chinese are building ports in Western Canada. Those are going to be naval bases. So the Chinese are building up their logistical centers for operations for when they invade the United States, both inside the United States with the Trojan forces and outside of it in Canada. I mean, I know people have like the memory span of a goldfish, but I don't know if people remember the story about allegedly some bunker being hit on the Canadian-U.S. border that had a bunch of Chi-Com troops in it. You know, it wasn't some enormous number of troops, because you don't have, thousands upon thousands of troops living in some bunker, but it was definitely a suspect case, and there were definitely some munitions dropped, and some people killed. I'll just put it that way. But it wasn't in no crazy numbers like the thousands, But then there was also the case of the pilots. The aircraft went down somewhere around Michigan, and there were foreign troops clad in black like frogmen coming across in rafts. So they were looking for the pilot. Be reminded, and I've covered this a long time ago, very long ago. And for those who have been with me for a long time, you remember that I covered this. But the Chinese have EMP cannons where they can actually direct an EMP to take down aircraft and things like that. It's like a miniaturized EMP, and it's like in the form of like a cannon. Like you can set it up on a tripod and use it. It's very similar to the kind you've seen where they're in that one video where they're driving a motorcycle and they use this EMP gun, and it just shuts off the motorcycle while in the middle of driving, and it just crashes. I don't know if people have ever seen that video before, but that's a very similar concept to what they've been using to down various aircraft, especially aircraft that fly close to the borders, like the Iraqi Air Force general that came to the United States to train on an F-16. He was flying an F-16 by the border, and is just, lo and behold, his F-16 just goes down. They don't let aircraft fly unless they're in perfect working order. All the maintenance procedures that have to be done to clear any aircraft to fly are immense. And I know we had to go through a hell of a lot of procedures just to clear our ground vehicles in the Army. Now, for the Air Force, it's even more stringent than it is in the Army, because when you're dealing with flying, there's a lot more hazards involved inherently with flying than with driving. Because when you're driving a vehicle and a vehicle breaks down while you're driving it, you could just step out and you're on the ground and you're safe. If something happens in mid-flight, you're going to crash. And if you can't eject on time, you're done. Your ass is grass. So I'm just reminding people to be aware that there's a lot of subversive activities, infiltration and subversive activities and sabotage and covert types of operations that are going on that most people aren't aware of, especially your average everyday Joe Blow that couldn't care less about the types of things I'm talking about. But these types of things, they're going on. They're going on. And people better, get a handle on it and be aware of it, because we are going to get invaded, and we will be invaded by enormous armies. And no, they're not going to nuke their own troops. They will use some nukes, but Mystery Babylon USA does not get a shot off. We do not get a shot off. When we're attacked, it's like a surprise. When they cut the satellites, the comms, everything, we have no means of communication. If you've been listening to my audiobook and you've watched my documentaries, then you understand how all the procedures happen and how it works. So all in all, what I'm getting at here is that, all the media spin around all this nuke stuff. It's like every other month, the flavor of the month is, oh my God, nuclear holocaust, nuclear holocaust. Oh my God, fear, 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 be scared. It's getting ludicrous. It's getting out of hand. And that video I shared from that Duran channel, even they said, that, look, all this nuke hype is probably what could have gotten Zelensky to even think about, doing something like this. Even the NATO people are going to have to shut him down, because they don't want to experience the wrath that is Russia and the Russian military, because the Russian military is, very formidable. They're not a threat to be taken lightly. You know, I see them as a major threat. And I see China as an even bigger threat. And China hasn't even done anything just yet. You know, I mean, Russia hasn't even begun to try. But I see this force that they're building, the force that they're building in southern Belarus and also in Belgorod. They're going to move very quickly on Ukraine because now that all the cat's out of the bag and now that the West understands that their communications are not so privileged, I'll just say, you know, they're not so secret, you know, that they've been compromised because Ben Wallace even said that their communications with America have been compromised in Britain. So, you know, that just goes to show you that the West is being effectively spied on by the Russians, and they know everything that the West is trying to hatch, what kind of plots they're up to, and scheming and everything else. So it just goes to tell you that this is very unlikely that such a thing is going to happen. Now, you know, there's a lot of, you know, loose ends that that haven't been tied up yet, in the sense that, you know, there's a lot of people out there that are, you know, they're up to no good. You know, they would like to do something like that, like conduct a nuke FF or a dirty bomb FF. You know, they would love to do something like that, but if you understand prophecy, then you know how things unfold. You know, it's not going to happen like that to where, you know, we get involved in some kind of conflict with China or Russia or both before we've had our collapse in our internal conflict. So I just caution people to use reason, you know, be reasonable, you know, like listen to reason and understand that, look, if you believe in prophecy and you fully put your faith in God, then you know how things are going to happen and how they're not going to happen. So I really, I mean, even if they did pull some kind of nuke FF, it's not going to go into a full nuclear war. And here's why. Because if somebody that's unhinged still manages to conduct such a false flag, you're going to see the West disengage like you have never seen anybody run away from something before. You're going to see them disengage so hard from Ukraine, they're going to cease and desist all support to Ukraine if something like that happens, because they're going to want to move as far away from such a thing as possible, because they're not going to want to get their asses knocked off. You know, they're not going to want to get, you know, annihilated over some proxy conflict. They're not, look, these Western elites, yes, they're stupid. They're very arrogant, but they're not all the way suicidal. They're only suicidal in the sense that they want population reduction in their own power block, no less. But they want population reduction. But they're not that way to the point to where they want to lose everything, including themselves. They just want to eliminate as many of their own people as they can, which is really stupid, because in eviscerating your own power base, you're setting yourself up for an invasion from somebody that's a lot more powerful than you, who can kick your ass all around the map, and that's China especially, but also Russia. So Russia could take NATO single-handedly. You know, they don't even need China to help them, just like China doesn't need anybody to help them take over America. But Russia and China, being thick as thieves, being the closest allies of each other, they're going to help each other in both Europe and North America. You know, both Western Europe and North America will be invaded by the same Sino-Russian alliance. They're going to build a coalition, and they're going to invade Western Europe and North America. You know, the United States and Western Europe will be conquered. They'll be conquered. So Russia is going to enlarge itself. You know, Ukraine's going to lose. You know, it's a guarantee. I mean, you know, 300,000 troops in addition to what they've already ground Ukraine down with in the east. I mean, if Ukraine had such an issue managing a mere, you know, 70 battalions worth of forces, that was largely all that was there, you know, I mean, up until now that they're building up 300,000 additional troops, if Ukraine had such a hard time managing with the 70 combat battalions, which is like 63 to 65,000 troops. If you're going by average Russian battalion sizes, all added up together, they're going to have a hell of a time trying to withstand a total tidal wave that's called 300,000 Russian troops. Belarus doesn't even have to get involved insofar as, contributing forces. Nobody else has to get involved because what Russia's assembling is more than enough to deal the final hammer blow. Because let me explain something. When we invaded Iraq, yes, the Iraqi military was horribly depleted from, since the Gulf War, having lost all that it lost. It was a lot bigger and a lot, badder in every sense of the word back in the first Gulf War. But still, we still had to go in there with 160,000 troops. And that's just on the ground. That's the ground troops. And that's not counting the Air Force personnel that supported the mission or the ground crews or the logistical forces that were in Kuwait and Saudi. It's not counting that. It's just the troops that marched in there was 160,000. So Russia assembling 300,000 troops for a country the size of Ukraine, or what's left of it, and what's left of their capabilities, that's like a tidal wave. It's like a tidal wave. It's like a tsunami coming at Ukraine. They're not going to be able to stop it. They're not even going to have a chance in hell of even slowing it down, because those forces in the east that they've been so laser focused on fighting, try and take back LPR and DPR, which they can't do. They still can't do it. They haven't managed to dislodge Russia for going on 7 months now. They haven't been able to dislodge them. They can't dislodge them. They can't. They still can't. And they have to tell all these lies and keep making up excuses as to why, Ukraine hasn't won this thing, because they can't win this thing, because they're not strong enough to win this thing. Russia hasn't even tried yet. And I'm not talking up Russia. I don't care about Russia. I could give a shit about Russia, but I'm just telling the truth about Russia, because Russia's a big-ass country with a big military. They have plenty of resources to bring to bear. They haven't even hardly used any of them yet. Just the enormous stockpiles that country sits on from both the USSR and since, Russia got independence from the USSR and became its own independent nation. Just the stockpiles that they have are enormous. They haven't even begun to burn through them yet. They're building up these massive forces to overrun Ukraine, and they will succeed. And I think that this whole thing will prompt them to act a whole lot faster than people realize. Like I said in the last couple of lives, I said, you know what? My personal estimate, just for shits and giggles, would be 2 weeks to a month, like 2 to 4 weeks. Maybe a little longer, but now that this happened, I think that it'll fall between that 2 to 4 weeks range. I really do, because once they build up their last bit of logistics, I see them just going ahead and prosecuting this thing as soon as possible. I think they're going to hurry up because they don't want to give Ukraine a chance to conduct a false flag attack, or the West to be able to do it in Ukraine's name. And then, they don't want that to happen. And, the Russians are going to try and act, quasi-responsibly, I guess, and try to end this thing soon, because the longer they let it drag on, the longer it becomes possible for somebody that's unhinged in any of these Western regimes, or even in the regime in Kiev, for someone that's unhinged to try and conduct a plot like that, a false flag like that. I don't think the Russians are going to give them any time to even consider doing something like that. I think they're going to go ahead and end this thing. So they're going to hurry up. They're going to quickly invade and deal the final death blow, and that'll be the end of Ukraine as a sovereign nation. It'll be brought under Russian control. And I mean the whole country. It looks like they're going to just go ahead and knock the whole thing out. There's no other choice for them but to do that. So what's the end of it going to look like? Well, here's what it'll look like. Ukraine no longer a sovereign nation. It'll lose its sovereignty. It'll be inducted into a new, Russian empire. The West, I see NATO falling apart right after this because, like Jens Stoltenberg said, this would be a major defeat for NATO. This will be worse than NATO retreating from Afghanistan was, and that was a disaster because that was a whole NATO mission. So NATO retreated from Afghanistan in failure. They haven't been able to succeed in Syria. It's a long string of failures. And then for the proxy of Ukraine, something that they dumped more money, more weaponry, more everything into than even Afghanistan or any other place, for them to fail there, and that's in their own neighborhood in Europe, for them to fail there would be immense. Turkey is already showing signs, and they have been. I've said this a long time ago that I see NATO falling apart because you see a lot of shaky things going on already. Because you see Turkey and Canada sort of, Turkey sort of moving towards Russia and Canada moving towards China because Canada is essentially, for all intents and purposes, a Chinese vassal state, even though they're part of NATO too. For them to have Chinese troops in there shows that Canada is beholden to China for some reason, and I think it's because the Chinese have caught their regime, their leadership, doing things that they shouldn't have been doing, and they've been holding it over their heads, and that's it's like a catch-22 to where, the Chinese have this dirt on Canada, but the Canadian leaders, they have to serve China and NATO, but at the same time, it's like they have to keep themselves in power as long as they can because you notice the same douchebag is the leader still of Canada. They have to keep themselves in power as long as they can so that they can keep serving China so China doesn't, release whatever dirt they have on them, but then they also have to play the game with NATO too. So it's like a hell of a catch-22 situation. And it all makes sense now. I mean, like when you really look at it, it all makes total complete sense, the whole entire thing. So NATO's going to fall apart after this colossal loss. There's no pathway to victory for Ukraine or for NATO in any of this. NATO's depleted itself. It's hollowed out. It's depleted. It's gone. And that goes back to what I said at the very beginning about the German military, but the French and British militaries aren't much better. They're really not much better. The Italian military, too. Those are the four biggest NATO contributors in Western Europe. None of their militaries are ready to fight any sort of war, not even a defensive war, because they've all let their militaries go to absolute, complete BS, just rubbish. I mean, they have like nothing left to fight with. I mean, they've depleted and hollowed themselves out worse than even we have. But here's the kicker. Even as bad as we've depleted ourselves, even though we still have more than what our Western European allies have, the Western European woke allies defeated the woke Marine Corps on the woke Marine Corps' own installation in California. I'll never forget that. I will never forget that. That the Marine Corps lost to the last man. Like every last man was killed in that exercise between, the British were there, the Australians, the UAE, and one other country I can't remember. But I'll never forget the fact that the Marines got beaten by our woke allies. So what does that say? I mean, they got beat bad, too, to where they lost every single man. They had to reset the whole exercise. I mean, it's just stuff like that. It just shows you that the priorities in Western militaries are all ass backwards. They're all ass backwards. Like, it's all about this woke stuff. It's this inclusion stuff, this, user-friendly stuff where they have to please everybody and they have to accommodate everybody and they have to do green stuff now, plant trees and, make green projects for like green new armored vehicles. And I thought that was a joke at first, but it's actually real. They're trying to make a hybridized armored vehicle. And they even said that they wouldn't be able to do something like that for maybe 10 years. And they're pouring all this money into it. Another waste of money. It's lunacy. It's total lunacy. And they purged our best people. They got our troops on welfare programs because, see, the Army used to pay really good when I was in, but now they got to put them on welfare. Like, what's really going on, man? What's really going on? It's just total lunacy. I mean, they're depriving them of meals in some cases, like what they've done on some certain naval ships. I mean, even on certain bases where they've had like readiness days or stand down days, they've deprived them of meals here and there. I mean, I've heard the stories. I mean, it's really off. I don't understand. I mean, their morale is very low, but I just don't understand how somebody in the military hasn't really like objectively looked at things and been like, look, this political leadership has to go. we have to do our duty to the Constitution and get rid of these people. I mean, it's like, I mean, whatever you think of the guy, Monograph said something funny once where he said he was going to send the generals of the Joint Chiefs of Staff a bag of nuts because he said they didn't have any, and he's right. He's right. I mean, our enemies are like gung ho. They're ready to go. They're locked and loaded. They're tough. They're killers. They train to kill. They fight how they train. Our military, is busy looking at how I don't even know what to say. I mean, I was going to say something that might come off kind of crude, but I mean, come on, man. This stuff here, it's getting ludicrous. And the desperation that it's everything that's happening reeks of desperation on the part of this country. I mean, it's just there's no one that we can invade to get oil from at this point, because we cut off our own production, which was stupid. It's like we castrated ourselves on every front. You can't fight a war without fuel. So in the next war, I don't know how we're going to conduct offensive, much less defensive operations with the lack of fuel we have left in our strategic reserve, and just that we're at the mercy of other nations. People don't understand that. We are at the mercy of other nations now. We are at their mercy. If they cut us all off from oil at any one time, if they all cut us off, we'd be done overnight. Done. Finished. America's not a superpower. Not anymore. Not even close. It's not even close. It's hollowed out. It's broken. And the reason why it's hollowed out and broken is, one, because the people largely turned away from God, first and foremost. But then when you turn away from God, other things happen like pride. Pride blinds you to problems. People that think that something isn't broken don't want to fix it. They ignore things that are broken because they have pride. They think that just because they have pride in something that automatically nothing's wrong. Nothing's broken. Nothing needs fixing. No, you have to maintain what you have. If you don't maintain what you have, you lose it. And we've lost it. So, yeah. If you don't maintain it, you can't keep it. You lose. You lose. And we've lost all the way around. And the average American can't see it because they're blind. They're blinded by pride. They're blinded by, arrogance. They're blinded by whatever else. They don't see all the problems that need fixed. If you fix your problems, then you can maintain what you have, and then you'll actually be in good shape. But no, they don't want to admit that there's problems that need fixed. No, they're just content to just, live off their past reputation, our past reputation, like a credit card that's been declined, as I always say. You still got the credit card, but you ain't got shit on it. Yeah, that's America for you right now. It's a damn shame that we've got this way, but, it'll never get fixed because people won't ever admit there's a problem. Everything I mentioned that's a problem, people won't even admit to it, or they'll just look at it quickly and, overlook it again, because they don't want to acknowledge that that's the way things are. And it is. China's the number one superpower now. And we've fallen to a status of a regional power. And I doubt we would even be, much of that at the rate we're going, to totally castrating ourselves on all fronts. It's disgusting. It's disgusting. Not just on the oil, but on the food. You know, a starving country can't make war. A country without fuel can't make war. A country without industries can't make war. You know, that's exactly what's happening to us. It's exactly what's happening to us. We can't make war without any of those things. And we've lost the vast majority of all of those things I just mentioned. So how then could we ever hope to compete with a country like Russia, or especially China, China has 40% of the whole world's industrial base in China. 40% is all in China. Of the whole world, out of the whole world, it's all in China. How are you going to compete with a nation that's that industrialized? And Russia too, they have all these commodities. You know, Russia has a decent amount of industry, but it's, you know, nothing, nowhere near China's. But I mean, Russia has a decent amount of industry, and it's enough to compete with what we have. Actually, their military industrial complex is bigger than ours now. You know, what they have now for a military industrial complex is, you know, it's very similar in size, although not completely, but it's similar in size to what they had during their Soviet days. You know, whereas we actually used to be able to compete with the Soviet Union back then, when we actually used to produce a lot of steel, when we used to produce a lot of other types of metals, when we used to actually produce our own oil, when we actually used to have a lot of factories, we used to have a bigger military industrial complex. But that's all gone now. Did you know they wanted to shutter the Lima, Ohio tank factory? Yeah. Our only tank factory. At one point, they were talking about shutting it down. I'm not even joking about that. Our only tank factory. You know, China and Russia have many tank factories. We have one. We have one left. One. And they were talking about shutting it down. It's exactly an example of what the hell I'm talking about right now. It's disgusting. Totally disgusting what's happened to this country. It's been run into the ground and then some. You know, this is not a superpower. Not even close. Not even close. We will get our asses whooped in an all-out war. That's why I don't see this thing in Ukraine becoming that. Because I think deep down, the leadership in the West knows that there's no path to victory. There's no way they can win this thing. They're just trying to prolong it as long as they can and keep lying about it, hoping people will forget about it. Because it's going to be that embarrassing to them when their proxy fails so spectacularly, when the Russians run in there and just take the place over. It's going to sting. It's going to sting worse than a scorpion stings. It'll sting worse than a snake bite stings. It'll be the worst thing the NATO will have ever undergone as an alliance, and it'll shake it to its very foundations, and it'll break apart after that. So that wraps up my little discussion about what happens after Ukraine. You know, the NATO is going to break up and it's going to fall apart. The West is going to end, and it's going to end miserably. But before it ends, it's going to lose this massive proxy conflict, because when Russia knocks it out, all those weapons, all the money, all the resources everybody sent them will be for naught. It'll all be for nothing. And it'll be such a major blow to the capabilities of the West. It'll just be the end of NATO. Countries will lose their faith in the alliance. They'll start breaking off one by one, little by little. And then when it's time for the total collapse of the Western economies will all collapse, leading into civil, social unrest and civil conflict. In the case of Babylon, you know, that's even in the word. It says that violence or conflict will erupt among various leaders plural, like faction leaders of factions, like in my documentary. And then we get invaded by massive armies from all sides, inside and outside, all around, all sides, inside and outside, all the way around outside, all sides. That's what it says. And I believe that everything's lining up exactly the way the word says. So all I do on my channel is I do my best to convey that. I do my very best to convey that, to put the physical together with prophecy, to back up prophecy for all those who deny it. I like to show people in the physical how it all matches what prophecy says, and it very much does. So I'm going to greet everybody in here before I go. Let me see who's all in here. Hey, Miriam and Boris and Mary. Good to see you all. Well, yeah, here's the thing, Mary. The Eastern elites are different. They actually control their own central banks. The governments in the East, like the Chinese and the Russians and the Indians, and the North Koreans and Iranians, they all control their own central banks. The banks don't control the governments. The governments there control the banks. They control the issuance of currency. So that means the elites are in the regimes themselves. But in the West, the banks run amok. The banks are ran by these uber rich bankster gangsters, and the Western elites are these bankster classes, and they control the governments in the West. So it's a different power dynamic between the East and West, the Eastern and Western elites. But the West is going to lose, and lose horribly. And there is no West, because in the end times, the Bible doesn't even mention the West. Besides Babylon being destroyed, the West isn't mentioned. That's the last we hear of it, is Babylon being destroyed. So that's exactly what's lining up to happen, and exactly how it says it'll happen, with massive armies. Of course there will be some nukes. Of course. The city of Babylon, when it says, in 1 hour, that's the city of Babylon. That's the financial center. Of course they'll get nuked, but, and some other cities, but it'll largely be done by massive armies. This will be bigger than Operation Barbarossa. There's going to be a massive conventional force taking over the USA and Western Europe. Also Oceania, like Australia and New Zealand. Yeah, they're going to be knocked out too. But yeah, it's going to be a massive world war. It'll be the biggest war ever, and it'll be fought by enormous armies. And China will be bearing the brunt of a lot of the manpower. They'll be supplying a lot of the manpower that'll bear the brunt of all the assaults. Russia will to some extent too, but Russia doesn't have near as many forces as China has. China's just enormous. I've gone over their numbers more times than I can remember, all in my past work. So I thank everybody for coming. Thank you, Mary and Boris and Miriam and Juan. Good to see you. Well, I'm out of here, folks. This was a really good live. I hope people listen to this one, because this is jam-packed with information. Good information.